Okay, so my whole point of my clinic today is basically to get people started in weathering. My methods are not the only methods out there, and I don't consider them to be the best, but I am happy with the results that I get and the equipment that I use. So with that said, we'll move on, and I can show you here. I don't know whether you can see it, but there's only 2 pictures on this front page that are real. And if you haven't figured it out by now, it's this chassis car up top and the wheels. The rest are all weathered. Not some of them are good, some of them are not. It's up to you to make your decision. Here's where we started. This is done on an O-scale car, and the photographs are from a fellow, Rich DeVizio, who presented this clinic in an O-scale magazine, but this was done with conjunction, he and I, for the model railroading internet group. Anyway, this is where we start. My whole idea is to, and I used to belong to a group called Model Trains Weathered. And there was a group of guys, and they would all be sampling and doing all kinds of research and development to come up with different ways of doing things. And one of the ways they came up that I found is a great way to get people started, and it's relatively inexpensive. I use Winsor Newton water mixable oils. They're easy to use. They mix somewhat with water. The colors that I use are raw umber, burnt umber, raw sienna, burnt sienna. I also have zinc white and ivory black. And the zinc white and ivory black are gouaches, and gouaches are watercolors. And you would think water and oil don't mix. Well, the other thing that I use is microsol to help make this concoction go together nicely. And what you end up with is this slurry that, when applied to the model, and you don't have to be very particular about how you put it on, just don't do more than one side at a time. You quickly apply, covering the side using a brush, up and down. Doesn't matter whether you go up and down or sideways or whatever, but you get it into all the crevices if you can. And then using a wedge type makeup sponge, you come back and with the makeup sponge damp, not wet, but damp, you start picking off what you just put on with the brush. And it leaves a residue behind, which is similar to road grime. And this whole process, there are going to be areas where you're not going to be able to reach with the sponge, like under the walkway, into the detail of the hatches on the bottom and on the top. So you end up using a brush. And this brown slurry, like I say, it's supposed to represent grime. So once you're done, that's sort of what it looks like. And as you can see, it's not an even finish, and that's the way the dirt is on the car. It's a very mottled finish. So now what you have to do is get up underneath the walkways and do this, the hatches down below and in where the ladders are and the ends of the car and so on. So we continue. Now, if you have, I'm not sure if I can go back here, but if you were not happy with the way the letters turned out and you wanted the letters to look a little bit more gray, then add a bit of white to your mixture. And you come back and you go over the letters, and you can start to fade them out. As you can see, the word Western is fairly strong and pronounced, but yet Norfolk and have been toned down a bit to make it look like they are starting to form the weathering on the face of them. Now with the sponge, if you notice, it's not a flat edge, and on a makeup sponge, it's very defined edges. It's a wedge shape. The one end is probably about 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, and at this end that you see here, it's probably close to 1 inch square, or I don't know what that is. Hang on a second, I'll tell you. 1 inch square. It's probably about 25 centimeters for those, or 25 millimeters for those that are metric. And what I do is I just pick off the corners and the edges of the face of that end, so that when I do this, I don't leave lines of the edge of the sponge. So now you go in, you do the bottom sills, you do the ladders, you do try and get the end of the car, and you concentrate on the surrounding areas. Roof walks. And I use the brush to apply it again, but because of the area that you can't get in with the sponge, you may have to use a brush to remove it, or to, in this case, under the walkway. Instead of stroking the brush, you dab the brush, and it helps to give you that mottled look. If you stroke it, you're going to see the brush strokes. So it's just a matter of dabbing it in the same area until you get it uniform with the rest of the car. So you do all the supports. In a lot of the cars nowadays, they have the photo etched walkways, and you can do the tops of the walkways the same way, and the tops of the hatches and so on. And once you have the uniform color done, you can now put a little bit of that wash, I call it wash, on the brush, and using a toothpick, hold the brush up vertical, and with a toothpick, you just sort of pick the bristles back towards you, and when they snap forward, they'll spray the end of the car, which is what happens when you have the kick up from the wheels of the car in front, or even the wheels down below. In some cases, there's no platform. And you just keep on working at it, dabbing on the color just to get it even. And it's going to take a while to do, because especially on a car like this, you have all these little crevices, the nooks and crannies and so on, that you have to get into. And after a while, these brushes that you're using, they'll end up being dedicated for this process, because the dabbing effect will eventually start to bend the bristles, and you won't be able to use it as a proper paintbrush. So here we are doing the walkways on the top the same way, and a little bit on the hatches and the center part of the top of the tank. Done with the hatch, put it on with the brush, use the sponge to model it down. So now, if the sponge starts to get too dry, I have rubbing alcohol in a little pump sprayer, and I just quickly spray the sponge, and I can continue on going. You don't have to use alcohol. You can use the window wash fluid from your car. And I guess in the UK and Australia, they call it the windscreen, the blue liquid. I suggest you don't use the summer liquid, because it has ingredients in there to help get bugs off the windscreen. If you use the winter one, it has a little bit of alcohol in it and a little bit of ammonia. But there's more ammonia in the summer one, and you want to try and stay away from that. So we continue on. So here we are with That's what the face of a new brush looks like, or a new sponge looks like. So you mix a small batch of a little bit of black into your gouache, your white gouache, and now you start into the oils, the raw umber, and it makes up a rusty, creamy sort of gray. And that's what you're doing the hatches with. The one thing about some of these cars, and it helps to know which ones are which. Some of them have a fiberglass hatch. Of course, the fiberglass does not rust, but all of the hardware is metal. So in this case, you see the steel bar that goes across the top of the hatch. You have the hardware at either end that holds it in place. And what you're trying to do is to give it a really weathered look. If you ever have have the chance of rail fanning from on top of a bridge, I suggest you do it and have your cell phone or your camera ready, because there's not too many times that you're going to see the top of a rail car. You see the sides all the time. You see people who take all the photographs, the prototype photographs. They're always of the side of the car, and maybe it's a 60-degree angle. You get the side and the front, and you'll see a lot more of the underside than you do the top. But if you have the opportunity to be on an overpass and take pictures, by all means do it, because if you're going to get into weathering, you're going to need a resource of photographs that you'll need. So here we go again with the brush and just dabbing it, giving it that mottled look. And during the process, you can add different colors, like the colors that we're using, the raw umber, the white, the black, to change up the colors slightly. And you just keep moving along. Now, this process, as you get used to it, you will develop your own way of doing it, which is a good thing. I'm giving you the basics here. So there's two tubes. One is burnt sienna. I believe it's burnt sienna. No, raw. They're calling it raw sienna. And you put these two together. This is where you're going to get your rusty colors. They're all earth tones. The colors I use, like I said, are burnt umber, raw umber, burnt sienna, raw sienna. The burnt sienna and raw sienna are very orange in color, and the umbers are dark, earthy colors. So when you mix the two together, which is done here, you can now start to represent rust. And it changes the whole outlook by dabbing it on. And you just keep dabbing it. You'll notice in the top picture, it looks like it's all splotchy, like, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. But as you continue on doing it, you spread it out a little bit more, but you're not spreading it out evenly, but what you're doing is you're blending the edges into each other. And you go right down over the whole side of the car. Get down underneath the walkways, in around the bottoms of the hatches. And that's how it looks so far. Now, you'll notice below each hatch, under the walkway, it's a little bit darker below each hatch and clean in between, or relatively cleaner between. That's because you're getting the rust coming off the hatch and it's starting to come down the side of the car. And the whole idea is to take what Mother Nature does, comes from top and starts to wash down the sides. So now you start adding it to the hatches and around them. And you just keep on dabbing to get what the look that you want. And it's all, again, personal choice. So if you use a little bit of alcohol on the brush, you can take off some of the paint to soften it a little bit, or you can just keep on going until it's the way you want it. So there's almost finished. The hatches, you can see where there's some paint showing through, and where the ribs are, it's a little bit darker because that's where the water sort of hangs out, and it tends to create rust puddles. So now comes the rust pits and streaks. These are actually easy to do, and a lot of people find it very intimidating. I love doing this. And the nice part about it is when you try and do it, if you don't like the way it turned out, you just wet your brush again, wipe it off, and start again. That's, of course, after the main grime is dry. So what you end up doing here is you put dabs of oil paint, or it can be done with gouaches, but if you use oil paint, you put the dabs on, and then you come back with a wider brush, dampened, and you come down over the streak, and you get like where that dot is. You have the dot at the top, and you just drag it down. I like to use a fan brush. When I did this, I wasn't using a fan brush, but a fan brush works better because it doesn't put a lot of pressure on that dot when you're pulling it down. And if you're anything like me, you may want to take a ruler or something and just hold it so that you can put your brush up against the edge of it when you draw down. That way, you guarantee that you get a straight line down. I used to be able to draw straight lines when I was a young punk, full of you-know-what. And I had no problem. I didn't need something to help me guide my hand down to make a straight line. But nowadays, it's better that you use something to guide it.
Can I interrupt for a moment, Ralph?
Certainly you can.
I have made a big blunder, and I have started the stream early. We were about 15 minutes early. So, would you like to start again? It is now 9 o'clock, and we should be correct. So, if I go on to mute, would you like to start again? And for those that have already
Martin.
Those that had already watched already will get a rerun of it.
Okay, hang on.
Okay, there.
Okay. So, for those who haven't seen or haven't been here, my name is Ralph Renzetti, and I'm a member of a Modeler's Life podcast, Model Railroading Live. I also have my own Facebook page for weathering called A Touch of Yesterday. I have a presentation on weathering a rail car. Let me bring it up on the page. We'll start again. Come on. You can do it. There we go. One of these days I'm going to pay for the service and we'll get the product to work. So this is my clinic, and this is the front page of the clinic. There are only 2 items on that page that are real. All the rest are models. So there's the first real one, the wheels, and the chassis car above it. And my idea is to try and replicate what Mother Nature does. So starting with this is an O-scale car. And this is a collaborative clinic that I did with Rich DeVizio. And it's quite interesting to see how it turns out. So we'll move on. Now, first order of business, to make a fade. The idea is to fade the car down so that you're actually adding grime to make it look sort of dirty, a little bit dirty. By the time you're finished, it'll be a lot dirty. I use water mixable oils and gouaches, and I mix a slurry using microsol as a liquid and a little bit of windscreen fluid, window washer for your car. And the oil, believe it or not, oil and water do mix in this case, but it takes a bit of doing to get it there, and that's why we use the microsol. So I used a raw umber and just a touch of white, and using the brush, apply it liberally on the side of the car. You don't have to worry about brush strokes because you're going to take it off. So apply it on the nice flat surface of the car, and don't do any more than one side at a time, because this stuff sort of dries, I wouldn't say really quickly, but you don't want to have it drying and you forget that it's there, because then you'll have a real problem. So you put it on, slap it on with the brush. You don't have to be careful how you put it on. Just get it all over the side of the car. And then take a makeup sponge. You dampen the makeup sponge with that window washer that you have from the car. I have a little pump spray that I fill using the big gallon jugs that we get it in. And I just spray my sponge. I don't want it soaking wet. I want it just damp, because I want to be able to pick up the liquid off the surface. And what you're doing is you're evening it out. The sponge is not picking it up completely, and it's leaving a mottled finish. So there's going to be areas where you're going to have to go later and do, like the sill, the hatches down below, the walkway on the top, and underneath the walkway. Those are areas that you're not going to be able to get at with the sponge. So you're going to have to do them a little bit differently. So that's what it looks like done just with the sponge so far. You'll notice the lettering is fairly pronounced still. And if that's fine with you, even if this is the way you like it, then you can stop here. It's all a matter of personal choice when you do this. So in order to get the lettering a little bit more faded, and actually to add a little bit more interest to the car too, add a little bit of white to your slurry of oil and gouache and windshield washer liquid and microsol. Get it all nice, and I find this very therapeutic doing this. And then you start putting it on top of the letters, and you can see that the Norfolk and the word "and" have already been done, and Western still has to be done. And you can see the difference just by adding that little bit of white. So now it's time to get the rest of the stuff. So you do all the surrounding areas, the sill, the end plates, the ladders, and underneath the walkways. And the idea here is, because you can't get in with the sponge, you can use the same brush that you're applying it with, but now you dab it, and you keep dabbing it until you get a finish that's very close to what you have on the side of the car. Just even it out by dabbing it. And you can get right underneath, then do the tops of the walkways. You can come back and do the tops of the walkways with a sponge afterwards, but you get the main part that you cannot get with the sponge, you do with the brush. So now that you have the side done and under the walkway done, you can now do the end plates of the car. And you'll notice on the right picture, there's some spatter on that end plate. And you achieve that by loading the brush with some of that liquid and then just take a toothpick and hold the brush up near the end of the car and use the toothpick to flick the hairs, pull the brush hairs towards you and let them go forward, and it'll spatter the car. The liquid will come off onto the car. I've taken an old toothbrush, and the toothbrush had, I think it was 5 rows of bristles on it. I cut 4 rows off and left 1 row in the center and use that now, and I can use my thumb to flick the bristles. So you continue now with the hatches down below, and with all the little nooks and crannies, you have to cover it all and get it fairly evenly coated to this similar as you have on the sides, although on the bottom it may be a little bit heavier because it doesn't get washed off like the sides and the top do. Then you come back with your sponge, and if your sponge starts to dry up on you, you can use that little spritzer that you got either with alcohol or with window washer and put some more moisture into the sponge and continue on going. Just lightly dab it until you get the result you're looking for. So here we have the different hatches. They're pretty well all the same, but you have the different effect as you go on. And the idea here is to, and it helps to know the car. The hatch could be fiberglass, the hatch could be aluminum or steel. So it's good to know what it is so that you don't rust something incorrectly. The hardware that's holding the hatch on is definitely metal, and it's going to leave marks. Even if that is a fiberglass hatch, it's going to leave marks on the hatch. And all of the water and so on, and the rusty water and grime that falls down on that hatch, you'll notice in the top left-hand picture, there's like a star pattern of ribs. Well, that's going to capture all the water. It's all going to stick around those ribs. So at the bottom, you can see how it looks. And then you start dabbing the tank again, but on the top, you can use a sponge as much as possible, but if you've got the brush handy and it's working for you, do as much as you can and build it up until you get it, again, looking like the side of the car, or maybe a little bit less than the side of the car. It's totally up to you. But as I mentioned, if you have the opportunity to rail fan from an overpass, have your camera or cell phone ready, because there's very few opportunities you get to see the tops of cars that go under the bridge. And it makes for good reference library when you start doing this. So now to add the rust points to the metal parts, there's a combination of raw umber and raw sienna. And the two of them, the raw sienna is more of an orange color as opposed to the raw umber being sort of an earthy tone. The two of them together give you that rusty look. And you stipple the texture to get the pattern you want. So this is what we're doing now. So it's when you start putting it on, you're going to see all the brush dabs that you put on. The idea is to smoothen them out just by continually going over it. Because it's oil paint and gouache, you'll have some working time. So you'll be able to blend it. You blend all the brush strokes into each other. And by the time you get done, it'll look like down on the right-hand side on the bottom. Oh, I just hurt my back. Okay. Anyway, so now you have to do under the walkways. And you do that with a brush because the sponge is not going to fit. and you just keep dabbing away with a little bit more of the rusty color by the brackets, and blend it out towards the center between each one. You're going to have a little bit more rust streaks where each hatch is that comes down that way. And that's what it ends up looking like so far. The trucks and that are a whole new ball game, and I think that's, well, we'll get there. But this is what it looks like. You'll notice where the hatches are. There's more rust coming down from where the hatches are than there is in between them. Then you have a little bit of where the brackets are. And again, this is the amount that you put in here is totally up to you. My recommendation, if you're going to do this, is that you use a prototype photograph to go by, and only as a guide, not that you're trying to replicate the photograph, although sometimes people ask you to do that for them. So right now, you got to get, I don't say you have to get into weathering. For those who want to get into weathering, it's better to build up confidence and a style of doing it. So by using this, I'm helping you get out of the chair and get cracking. So now we put some more rust on the roof, in around the hatches, on top of the hatches. Of course, the metal brackets that are holding them on, they're going to rust, and the rusty water that comes off of them, it's going to sit in where those ribs are, like the grime did before. Now you got rust sitting there, and you just keep adding it until you're satisfied. That basically is a finished hatch and surrounding area. And in this case, you may see that it's a little bit grainy. That's okay, because that's the way rust starts. It starts pitting through the paint. So then there's actually doing the rust pits and streaks. Now in this case, since we've got all that grime and everything, and the general rust that sort of bleeding through the paint, we now want to put pit marks and streaks. So you take a little bit of oil paint. Burnt umber is a good one to start with. And you put little dabs, and you'll notice there's quite a few little dabs all over the place there. And that's all you have to do, is just put one little dot or a couple of little dots side by side. And now you come back, you let it sit for a couple of minutes or so. You come back and you moisten the area below the dot. You can actually, if in the right-hand picture, you can use your small brush again if you want, if you only want a tiny bit. I like to get that streak coming down, and I started out using that thick brush. I now have gone to a fan brush, and the thick brush tends to put too much pressure on that dot of oil, and it distributes it too much. By using the fan brush, you don't get as much pressure on the dot when you're coming. You start above it and you come down below it. And I like to use a ruler to drag my fan brush along the side of, so I guarantee a straight line. I used to be able to do straight lines without that, but now I rely on a ruler to guarantee that line. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, that's kind of what you're aiming for. Now, if you want bigger ones than that, that's fine too. Because what ends up happening, you're going to get in around where the brackets are. You're going to get rust coming down from there as well. You're going to get rust marks in and around the ends, the brackets, the rivets on the ladder, the chain on the brake wheel. So it's a good idea to go through all of those things with a little bit of that color. You don't have to drag it off, but you can come back with a damp brush just to blend it in. so you have to make sure you do both ends. So you did the spatter on the right side there, on the one on the right. Now you do the spatter on the left, and it's stuff that's kicked up by the wheels or the car in front. The wheels from the car in front, they hit the car. That's how these ends get dirty. So couplers are a big thing with me. I started doing all kinds of couplers, or doing all kinds of weathering on them, and found that it was starting to jam them up a little bit. So you have to be careful now how you put your rusting materials, your paints, on the mechanism. You want to try and keep it away from the moving parts and keep it away from the inside of the knuckle, so that when the car does couple with another one, it slides in nice and smoothly. And what I do is I coat the inside with graphite from a pencil. It helps to make them slide. Stay away from the spring, but the coupler box definitely needs some work. The shaft of the coupler needs some work, but try not to get too much on the top and bottom as it goes into the box. It may jam into one side or the other because it's you're adding more material than is necessary. And then we come to the trucks. Now these trucks come apart. Not all trucks do. When I do my locomotives, I pull everything apart that I can to get at it. And this is the sort of thing I do. Right now I'm using a product called Rust-Oleum. You can either get the primer that's in a dark brown, or you can use primer chocolate brown camouflage paint, or Rust-Oleum patio furniture satin finish, and coat them. Now, most of these couplers, especially if you're working in N scale and HO scale, the plastic that they use is called Delrin, and Delrin does not play nice with paint. You can paint it all you want, and as soon as it twists or you touch it, the paint flakes off because it doesn't stick. I found the Rust-Oleum does. It's the one that outperforms anything else I've tried. So once I've got it primed, then I come back at it with some burnt umber. Sorry, raw umber first, then burnt umber, and touch it up with a little bit of raw umber again. So there's the gouaches, and that's what I'm using is gouaches to do the side frames of the trucks. Some people like to paint the wheel faces. I do on the larger scales. I do not do it in the N scale. It's just too small, and the paint, even though you've put a thin coat of paint on in N scale, that's like a couple inches thick in real life. So I try not to make anything that's going to jam on me. So you stay away from the pivot point on the wheel, the bearing point. In this case, you also want to try and make sure you keep your paint off the tire of the wheel. The tire is where the flat part where the flange is. If you do get paint on there, it's a good idea to clean it off later. I've seen some guys don't bother, and it's just asking for trouble. So after all is said and done and you've got all your different colors on, you'll notice there's a sheen along the top edge of the metal parts. That's done with the graphite of a pencil. You just take an HB pencil or a number 2 pencil, and you just drag it along the top edge, just on the edge, and then come back and rub it with your finger. I add a little bit of grayish black enamel where the bearings are to represent an oil face, because the enamel is going to be gloss. A little bit of more rust on the springs because they're constantly moving. You can get some of the burnt sienna. You can see it's in the crevices. And it's all done. I do it all with gouaches. Some guys are doing it with pan pastels, which I won't go into right now. I'm not a supporter of pan pastels for doing weathering on rail cars and locomotives. To me, it just doesn't work. But I won't go into that. So there's your finished car with rust streaks, with excessive rust over the first part of Western. And again, it's if you have a prototype photo to work from, this is where a lot of this detail comes in. You're taking it from a prototype photograph, and I urge you to use a prototype photograph. If you try and do it from your mind's eye, you will guarantee overdo it. It's best to work from a prototype picture. If you can't get one of the exact car you want, find one that looks the way you want it and use that as a guide. But don't go from what you think it should be. Otherwise, it will look like you overdid it. So, with all that said, here's a G-scale pile driver. And this guy's an excellent modeler. And I've asked him if I could use these photographs. And he said, yeah, no problem. Well, there's the perfect example. He's got all the rust on the tank, which that's the way he saw it. And usually when we're talking equipment this old, you may not have reference pictures, but you have to try and find something that's going to give you an idea of what it's going to look like. We all know that rust, metal, wherever you put it, is going to rust, and it's going to leave rust streaks going down. And he's got all these rivets and bolts and anchors that are holding this thing together, but no rust streaks down from them. And they're all rusted, but there's no rust streaks going down. His wheel faces, some of them are done, some of them are sort of new, and that's okay, because occasionally they do change out wheels, and you got a wheel that's brand new. And he's done a great job. So much so that in 2010, when he did this, Peter Watson took first place at our National Narrow Gauge Convention in St. Louis. So it's all how you see things. Again, like I suggested, this is a model, but and so is this. The idea is to try and represent what you see in real life. And this is a cement car. And a lot of times, like that, the chassis car that was on the front page, there was a lot of cement that was spilled over that came out of those hatches when they were putting it in. And this car, believe it or not, was an Irish green. Another UP car. So you can see here now, there's the locomotive, and you have the rust coming down from the springs. There's a little bit of oil marks on the bearing pockets. The rust coming down from the stack. This was a black locomotive. Santa Fe was black with the white lines, and the stripes up here were white over black. So the idea is to get it to fade down. So you can use the presentation that I just gave you with the gouaches and the oil paints and so on, or you can spray on a fade. I chose to spray on a fade here, But before I did that, I took everything apart. I took the window glass out, took the dome light off. I had just the shell, and I even took the truck faces off. And away I went. Here's another one. This is the way the customer wanted it. That's another thing you have to take in as consideration. You show him prototype photographs and he says, no, I don't like that. I want it more. So that's you give him what he wants. This locomotive I did for Joe Fugate, publisher, owner of Model Railroad Hobbyist, as an anniversary gift for celebrating his 25 years with the Siskiyou line. I think that's how you say it. It's tongue teaser. He loved it. Apparently just before Christmas last year, or maybe it was in the summer, he was at a convention and he had it on the display and his wife turned it into a kit. She managed to knock it with her elbow and down to the floor it went. So you can see here there's the dirt and grime and the oily look, oil streaks from the fuel tank, and a little bit, I don't use powders very much, but in this case, there's a little bit of powder that I was able to do the streaks with from the louvers. Of course, you have the road grime that's kicked up. Depending on the area, you have to know the area before you put a color on there. You try and represent the color of the area when you put that dust, that road dust that forms up there. Here's another one. This is done for another fellow that was in New Jersey. The little rust pieces that are up here is done with a toothpick. This is an HO. Done with a toothpick. The top of this is done with the sponge. The general grime, first I faded it and then I put some general grime on the whole thing. And then I used an oil-based product to give me this sort of streaking look. These cars, there's 2 of them. I did 6 of these for one of the presenters you're going to see tomorrow, Thomas Gazer. This is for the Split Rock Mining. He sent me the cabooses to do, and we did them in succession from number 1 to number 5. I had already done number 6 for him about a year before. So from 1 to number 5, I varied the difference in weathering, as you got a higher in number, it got less weathering because representing maybe a newer caboose. So that's it. If there's any questions, anybody?
We do have a couple questions, Ralph. One of the questions was talking about when you were talking about microscale. Somebody asked, is that the red bottle or the blue bottle?
It's the red bottle,
Okay.
microsol. And I've taken the liberty to. I went to the drugstore, and I managed to find an eyedropper at the drugstore that fit the top of the bottle. Okay. So I don't have to pour it out. So now I can it fits on the bottle, and I can go ahead and use it whenever I want just by adding a few drops.
And then the other, we got several others. One is color of rust. What was the color of Rust-Oleum primer you like to use? Okay,
so if you can't get any, like I mentioned, you have primer. There's also the one that you use on lawn furniture. There's another one, it's called camouflage. I try to get chocolate brown, close to chocolate brown as possible. It might be a little bit darker, might be a little bit lighter, but It's brown. That's a good starting point for your rust.
Would you approach structures the same way?
Structures are a whole new ballgame. That's where I would probably use some of the pan pastels. Pan pastels were originally designed for paper, canvas, wood, but not for plastic. And basically, pan pastels are chalk, pastel chalk. The nice thing about them is there's like 72 different colors. So you have all your choice of colors for doing structures, especially if it's a wood kit, because now you can rub it into the wood and it looks like faded wood that has some color still in it, like how the paint chips off and so on. But other than that, I wouldn't use this method on structures unless they're plastic.
All right. What do you use to seal your powders with? Is a question somebody has brought up.
The powders that first of all, the powders I use are paint pigment, like true paint pigment. I use either Bragdon powders, AIM or Monroe powders, or there's a couple of other ones. Doc, somebody from Micromark, I believe. And then, anyway, what you want is paint pigment. And they need to be applied on a dull finish, a dull coat, whether it's acrylic or dull coat, which is a lacquer. But they need something to grip onto the tooth of the matte finish, and you scrub them in. You just don't brush it on. I've seen people use a big brush like this and just lightly put it on, and then they wonder why when they go to seal it, it disappears. If you scrub it on, it won't. And when I seal it, it depends on if I'm going to use any of the. I've started to use AK and MIG products. These are mineral based, and if you're using mineral based products, do not use dull coat, because the mineral spirits that you use on these dissolves the dull coat. So an acrylic matte is what you want to use to seal your pigments in that case. Otherwise, I finish everything. When I'm done, doesn't matter. Like a locomotive that I just did, it has oil, watercolor, acrylic, and these things as well. And I finish it off with dull coat.
How long have you been weathering professionally?
10 years. 10 years, 10 long years. And the whole thing that I think people don't realize, they figure, well, I'm going to try and weather this. And they do it and it looks like crap. And they figure, no, I guess that's not for me. Well, I have one thing to tell you. The more you do it, the better you get. The better you get, the more confidence you'll build. The more confidence you have, you'll be willing to attack anything. I went out and I bought myself, when I first started, a $300 Broadway Limited Mikado. And I thought to myself, there's no way in hell that I'm going to make that thing dirty. I'm confident enough now that I can take a $400 or $500 locomotive and go right at it. No problem, as long as I have a prototype photograph to go by.
So somebody asked, if I'm wanting to get into weathering, what would be your first piece of rolling stock that you should weather?
I would go with a closed model. So either the gondola like was in the presentation, or a box car, or a tank car. Tank car is a little different story though, but it's a good starter point. I mean, one of the suggestions I can give you that worked for me. Go to these garage sales, go to these flea market train sales, and buy up all the cheap crap that's there to practice on. And once you develop your skill, you'll be able to make those crap cars look like something not bad.
All right. When you seal your work, how long is the drying time before you move on to the next step of weathering?
A lot of times I will use alcohol in the sealing, like the sealing liquid that I use. If it's acrylic, I use alcohol in it. If it's dull coat, you're using lacquer thinners, so you have to give lacquer at least 12 hours to air off, maybe a little bit less, but in and around that. And that's just so the gas comes off. But acrylics and so on, like that, or even when I'm working with the mineral-based paints, I went to the dollar store and got myself this. And this is a little fan. And it helps when I see that the surface is not wet anymore. You can see it change color as it dries. When it's dry, I go on to my next step. If I have acrylic down and I'm using oil on top, I know the oil's not going to affect the acrylic. So I have no problem doing it. When I have oil down and I'm putting a gouache on the top, I know water's not going to affect the oil. So it's all in the process that you use, one after the other. Some will say, well, you can't put water-based on an oil product. Well, you can. You just have to be very careful and do it properly, and vice versa.
What is your favorite type of weathering project? Freight cars, engines, diesel, or steam?
Locomotives, diesel.
All right. And what is the preferred oil paint to use when weathering?
I use Winsor Newton products, and there's another way of weathering that, and it's mostly that's actually the next step after this clinic. The next one is doing what they call the oil dot method. The oil dot method is you put dots of the color that you're using, whether it's burnt sienna or burnt umber or whatever, along with maybe a touch of white, a touch of green, a touch of blue, doesn't matter. And you're blending it all together to finish the side of the car. And that may not be the complete, you're not done at that point. You may have to go back and do it again and then blend it down until you get it looking the way you want. And I use Winsor Newton paints. And the reason being, like, I've tried them all. I've tried the Grumbackers. I've tried, you name it. The ones I keep coming back to are the Winsor Newtons. And the reason being, the pigment that's in the oil paints of Winsor Newton is very, very fine ground pigment. If I took some of that and put it into, let's say I took a little dot of oil and I tried to dissolve it in, I don't know, 1% oil to 99% thinner, you'll actually be able to see the grains of the pigment fall out of suspension. But when I do it with the Winsor Newton ones, it colors the thinner. It's that good. They're that fine. So I'm not saying you can't use the other ones. You can. These Winsor Newton ones, they're not exactly cheap. It's $12 a tube of oil, but that $12 is going to go a long way. You'll never use it up in a lifetime. The gouaches, they come in very small tubes. Where are we? There's the gouache tube, and that's the black one. So if you go to a paint store, a paint supply, and an artist supply, whatever, and you buy one of these, it's going to cost you maybe $6 for this tube. But if you can also get them at Michael's, and I say this so that you won't go out and just spend your money at Michael's. When you go to Michael's, make sure you get on the computer and look for a coupon. Because at Michael's, what I paid $6 for at the other art supply store, they're going to charge you $12 for.
All right.
So it's best to go directly to an art supply store.
So somebody's asked about the AK weathering pencils and if you have used them.
Yes, I have.
And what are your thoughts on them?
I have the whole set. I haven't developed 100% thoughts on it yet. I'm still working on it. I like the way they go down. I've used watercolor pencils probably now for 6 years, but they were a different manufacturer. These ones from AK, they have such a wide variety of color available that, and they dissolve beautifully. So there's the whole set. You don't have to buy the whole set. For weathering, you can get them in a 5 pencil set of the earth tones. This one comes with 34 colors, 35 colors. And they also have metallics. Now the metallics don't dissolve with water, which I found. But all the others, if you go on to YouTube and type in a search for AK weathering pencils, you'll see some of the work that the guys are doing with it. And I've tried that, and it does work just the way they show it. But you have to be prepared to work at it because it doesn't work easy. You have to use, when you use the water, it has to have some sort of surface tension cutter in it. So I use the window washer again because it has a bit of soap in it. And that breaks the surface tension of the plastic you're working on. And again, you have to work on a dull surface. They do work. You just have to work at it to make them work.
All right. So we have a question about somebody's modeling 1912 steam.
Yep.
And steam locomotive, wood cars. And any advice how to weather that stock?
The cars, I'm assuming it's the cars. Well,
Yeah.
The paint, some people will argue that, and it's all up to the way the railroad operated. So you're going to have to do some research. Some of them tried to keep their cars clean as much as possible. Some of them only brought them in occasionally for cleanup. So when the wood car ages, the paint fades. The metal brackets, usually bracing the outside, are what rust and cause streaks on the wood, but not the same way you would see a steel car streaking, because the wood absorbs most of the moisture before it can actually leave long streaks. I would fade the car. I would add rust to the brackets only and then do streaks.
All right. And then we're going to start winding this down here soon, but Ralph, how do you get the wet look on your oil stains?
Okay, there's a couple of ways of doing it. You can use an actual black enamel paint if you want. Thin it out a little bit so that it's not really thick. Apply it to where you want the oil stain, and then come back with a gloss after it's dry and just make it look shiny. Okay. So that's on wheel bearings. The one on the side of a tank, it's a different color that you're looking at, so you're probably going to use a brown color that you're going to thin down so that you don't get a solid, it's more transparent than anything else. And then again, you can come back with gloss, or you can just leave it as the initial application, because what ends up happening on the side of the fuel tank, you get dust buildup on the oil. So it's not always shiny. It'll be shinier up at the fuel fill than it is down the bottom of the tank.
All right, and then we do have a question: is do you do any other types of art?
I do. I do all kinds of things. My interests are all over the place. Sci-fi. I used to do black and white ink drawings of goalie masks, but they were all done with dots. So there was not a straight line in the picture. I don't have anything that I can show you, but if you can imagine, they call it dotalism. I studied architecture for 5 years, so my interests sort of fall that way. But I don't know whether you're going to see this or not. It's a space bike. This is what I'm working on at the moment.
All right. Yeah.
So I'm all, like I say, I'm all over the place. I started out modeling in model cars, and I never once used instructions. I always customized my cars, and to the point where I entered competitions with my cars.
Well, Ralph, we want to thank you for being the first clinician, and also thank you for giving a wonderful presentation, and thank you for being on the podcast as well. We'll be wrapping this up.
Okay.
For everybody watching, good time to get a drink, get a bag of popcorn.
And stay safe.
Yes, and as Ralph says, stay safe.
Thanks, Jordan.
You're welcome. Have
Bye.
a good night.
You too.